Margaret Turner was 60, a widow with kind eyes and short silver hair that framed her soft face. Her days had become quiet too, quiet since her husband passed away 2 years earlier. The house in Vermont that once echoed with laughter now felt like an empty shell. Every morning she followed the same routine: make coffee, feed the cat, read the newspaper, and water her plants. But no matter how much she tried to fill her time, loneliness had a way of seeping in through the cracks of her heart. So when her daughter Lisa called one Thursday afternoon, asking if she could take her grandson Ethan on a short trip before his school year began, Margaret didn't hesitate. Ethan was 17, tall, polite, and always smiling. He had been Margaret's light ever since he was little, visiting her during holidays and helping with small chores around the house. But lately, life had been pulling him in different directions. College applications, part-time jobs, friends, all the things that came with growing up. Margaret could feel him slipping into a world where she no longer fit. So this trip felt like a chance to reconnect. They decided on a small lakeside town 3 hours away. Margaret booked a cozy hotel she'd found online, charming, simple, and surrounded by pine trees. She packed light, a few summer dresses, her favorite book, and her husband's old scarf that she still carried wherever she went. The morning they left, Ethan showed up at her door carrying a backpack and that familiar grin that always warmed her heart. "Ready for an adventure, Grandma?" he said. The drive was peaceful. Margaret played old jazz songs on the radio, and Ethan shared funny stories from school. They stopped once for coffee and pie at a roadside diner, where she watched him joke with the waitress, noticing how confident he'd become. He wasn't a boy anymore. Somewhere along the way, the child who used to ask endless questions had turned into a young man who carried his own quiet thoughts by the time they reached the hotel. The sun was setting behind the lake. The water shimmered gold, and the air smelled of pine and summer rain. The hotel itself was charming: wooden walls, floral curtains, and the faint scent of lavender in the air. "It's like something from your old movies," Ethan teased as they checked in. Margaret smiled, brushing off the comment, but feeling something stir inside her. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe it was simply nice to be seen again. Their room had 2 beds, a small balcony, and a view of the lake. After unpacking, they went for a walk along the shoreline. The breeze was soft and the water lapped gently against the rocks. Margaret felt peaceful watching Ethan skip stones across the water, each throw perfect and effortless. She remembered how his tiny hands once held hers tightly when they crossed streets. Now his hands were larger, stronger, and filled with the confidence of youth. Ethan started talking about school, its upcoming senior year, and the pressure of choosing a college. He sounded uncertain, and she could hear the worry in his voice. "I don't even know what I want to do, Grandma," he admitted, looking out at the water. Margaret listened quietly, then said, "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Life doesn't come with a map, Ethan. You find your way step by step." Her voice was calm, full of the wisdom that only years could teach. They walked back to the hotel as twilight settled. Inside, the warm glow from the lamps made the room feel like home. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone while Margaret poured herself a cup of tea. She watched him for a moment, noticing how grown-up he looked, but also how vulnerable he seemed. It reminded her of her own son Ethan's father at that age, caught between wanting independence and still needing reassurance. Later that night, the sound of rain began to patter against the window. Margaret turned off the lamp and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to her husband, the man who used to hold her hand during storms. The laughter they shared and the little life they built together. She wondered if Ethan would ever know that kind of love someday, the deep, lasting kind that doesn't fade with time. Just as she was lost in thought, Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Grandma," he said softly. "Yes, dear," she replied, turning her head toward him. "I'm really glad you brought me here." His voice was tired but sincere. "It feels different. I don't know. I feel calm." Margaret smiled in the dim light, her heart swelling with warmth. "I'm glad too, Ethan. We both needed this." He smiled faintly before drifting off to sleep. Margaret stayed awake a little longer, listening to the rain, feeling both peaceful and emotional. For the first time in months, she didn't feel lonely. There was something about sharing that quiet space with someone she loved. Connection that words couldn't capture. But deep down she sensed something else. Ethan had been quieter than usual all evening, thoughtful in a way that made her curious. She didn't know what was weighing on him, but she could feel there was something he wasn't saying. She rolled onto her side, watching him sleep. The gentle rhythm of his breathing reminded her of when he was little, curled up beside her after a nightmare. The years had changed so much, yet in that moment, he was still the same boy-kind, sensitive, and full of unspoken feelings. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sound of the rain lull her to rest. She didn't know that the next morning, something Ethan would say would change her deeply, something that would remind her of who she was before life became routine, before loss dulled her spirit. The trip had started as a simple getaway, but it was quietly becoming something else. It wasn't just about spending time with her grandson anymore. It was about rediscovering parts of herself she thought she had lost: the strength, the warmth, the desire to feel alive again. As the rain softened into silence and dawn began to break, Margaret whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for this trip, for this boy who reminded her that love comes in many forms, and for the unexpected ways life still had of surprising her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she could feel something was about to change. And when it did, it would leave a mark on her heart she would never forget. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, painting soft lines across the wooden floor. Margaret woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee coming from the small table near the window. Ethan was already awake, dressed, and quietly scrolling through his phone. When he noticed her stir, he smiled. "Morning, Grandma. I got coffee from the lobby. Hope it's not too strong." His voice was light, but there was something thoughtful behind his tone, something she couldn't quite read. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, sitting up and stretching. "You're becoming quite the gentleman." He laughed and shrugged. "Well, someone had to bring breakfast. You were sleeping like a rock." They ate simple pastries and fruit together while the sunlight warmed the room. The air between them felt easy, comfortable, but under that calm, Margaret sensed a kind of hesitation in Ethan. He seemed distracted, staring out at the lake every few minutes as if his thoughts were miles away. After breakfast, they decided to explore the small town. It was a quiet place: cobblestone streets, wooden shops with flower boxes, and a little bakery that smelled of cinnamon and coffee. They spent the morning browsing handmade crafts and old books. Margaret loved watching Ethan walk beside her, taller than most people around, polite with every shopkeeper, and so full of potential. She felt proud but also nostalgic, remembering the boy who once held her hand crossing the street. At lunchtime, they found a small diner by the water. The waitress recognized Margaret's accent and started chatting about her own family, laughing about how fast kids grow up. Ethan smiled but stayed quiet, lost in thought again. When Margaret asked if something was bothering him, he shook his head and said, "Just thinking about stuff, Grandma. Nothing bad." The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. They returned to the hotel when clouds began to gather, hinting at another storm. Margaret sat on the balcony with a blanket over her lap, watching the water ripple under the soft wind. Ethan joined her with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. For a few minutes, they just sat there in silence. "Grandma," he said finally, breaking the stillness, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" His tone was gentle but serious. Margaret looked at him with concern. "Of course, dear. You can ask me anything." He hesitated, fiddling with the rim of his mug. "When Grandpa passed away, how did you handle it? I mean, losing someone you love like that?" The question caught her off guard. She didn't expect him to bring up her husband, not on this trip. For a moment, she stared out at the lake before answering. "It wasn't easy," she said softly. "The first few months were like walking through fog. You wake up, you move, you breathe, but nothing feels real. What helped was remembering the good things, not the loss itself." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I think I get it," he said. "Sometimes I feel like people expect me to be okay all the time. But I miss him too, you know? He used to help me with everything from fixing my bike to talking about school. Margaret felt her heart ache. She reached out and placed her hand over his. I know, Ethan. He loved you more than anything, and he'd be proud of you, truly. Ethan smiled faintly, but didn't look up. There was something deeper behind his silence. Margaret could tell this was more than just grief, which was about growing up. Facing life without the person who always made things make sense. As the rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the balcony railing, they went back inside. Ethan lay on one bed, staring at the ceiling while Margaret read her book quietly beside him. The storm outside grew heavier, the sounds soothing and rhythmic. For a while, it felt like time had stopped. Later that evening, they ordered dinner to their room. Ethan chose pizza and Margaret had soup. They talked about small things, his school friends, her garden, the movies they used to watch when he was little. But just as the laughter returned, Ethan's voice softened. "Grandma," he said quietly, "can I tell you something else?" Margaret looked up, sensing the weight of his tone. Of course. He hesitated before speaking. "I know you've been lonely since Grandpa died. Mom says you don't really go out or see friends much anymore. I worry about you." His words surprised her. She wasn't expecting that kind of honesty from him. She blinked, trying to hide the emotion in her eyes. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, "I didn't know you noticed." "I do," he said firmly. "You always take care of everyone else. But who takes care of you?" The question hit her like a wave. She had spent so many years being strong for others that she had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. She tried to smile, but her voice trembled slightly. "You don't have to worry about me, darling. I've had a good life." Ethan frowned. "That's not what I meant. I just think you still have so much ahead of you. You could travel, meet new people, do things you've always wanted. You shouldn't stop living just because Grandpa's gone." Margaret felt her heart tighten, not from pain, but from the truth in his words. She had been existing, not living. It was as if Ethan could see straight through her, the way only someone who truly cared could. "Maybe you're right," she said finally. "Maybe it's time I start again." Ethan smiled, relief flickering across his face. "That's all I wanted to hear." They stayed up late talking that night. He told her about his dreams of studying architecture, his fears about failing, and the pressure of growing up. She shared stories from her youth, how she met his grandfather, how she once dreamed of becoming a painter, and how life had taken her in different directions. The bond between them deepened in those quiet hours. It wasn't just a grandmother and grandson talking, was two souls reconnecting, understanding each other in ways they never had before. When Ethan finally fell asleep, Margaret sat by the window again. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and full of stars. She watched the reflection of the moon ripple on the lake and felt something stir inside her, a spark of hope. Maybe even joy. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. You shouldn't stop living. She realized he wasn't just helping her heal. He was reminding her who she used to be, someone strong, vibrant, capable of love and change. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt ready for tomorrow. She didn't know what it would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't done living. Not yet. And though she didn't know it then, Ethan had something even more heartfelt to say before their trip ended. Something that would touch her soul in a way she would never forget. The next day began quietly, with sunlight spilling through the window and the soft sound of waves brushing against the lakeshore. Margaret was the first to wake, feeling rested yet thoughtful. The night's conversation with Ethan still lingered in her mind, his words about living again, about not letting grief steal the rest of her years. She smiled faintly, realizing how mature he had become. When she looked over, Ethan was still asleep, his face peaceful, almost childlike. For a moment, she saw not the tall young man, but the little boy who once begged her for one more bedtime story. When Ethan finally stirred, he found her sitting by the window with a cup of tea. "Morning," he said, stretching. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep in," she replied, turning toward him. "Too much sunshine. It feels like a good day to do something different." Different. he asked, curious. Yes, she said with a spark in her voice. Let's make some memories. Let's not waste the day, Ethan grinned. I'm in. What do you have in mind? They decided to visit the nearby mountain lookout, a popular spot known for its stunning views. After breakfast, they packed a small bag, grabbed their jackets, and drove out of town. The road curved through thick trees, golden with early autumn colors. Margaret rolled down her window, breathing in the crisp air. It felt like freedom. Ethan played some music, soft and calm, and they sang along, laughing when they forgot the words. When they reached the lookout, the world opened wide before them, a breathtaking view of the lake shimmering below, framed by distant hills. Margaret's eyes filled with emotion. It's beautiful, she whispered. Ethan nodded. Grandpa would have loved this. They stood there together for a long time, not saying much. The silence between them was warm, full of shared memories and quiet understanding. Finally, Ethan turned to her. Grandma, he said softly, can I tell you something I've been keeping to myself? Margaret looked at him, her expression gentle. Of course, dear. What is it? He hesitated. His hands were in his pockets, his eyes on the horizon. It's about college. I'm not sure I want to go right now. She blinked, surprised. Not go? Why, Ethan? You've worked so hard for it. I know, he said quickly. But lately, I've been feeling lost. Everyone expects me to have it all figured out. What to study, what career to choose. But I don't even know who I am yet. I thought coming here with you might help me clear my head. Margaret listened carefully, not interrupting. She could hear the confusion and pressure in his voice. You don't have to have it all figured out, Ethan, she said gently. Life isn't a straight line. Sometimes it's okay to pause, to breathe, to understand yourself before you move forward. He looked at her, surprised by her calmness. You really think it's okay? She smiled. Of course. The best decisions come when your heart is ready, not when others expect them. Ethan sighed with relief. Thanks, Grandma. I was scared you'd be disappointed. Oh, my dear, she said, resting a hand on his arm. You could never disappoint me. You're finding your way, just like I once did. They took photos together, laughing as the wind tried to pull her scarf away. Margaret hadn't laughed that freely in years, for the first time since her husband's passing. She felt light, not because she forgot her sorrow, but because she was finally learning to carry it differently. On the drive back, Ethan suggested they stop at a little diner he'd noticed earlier. It was small and quiet, with old-fashioned booths and the smell of fresh pies. They ordered coffee and dessert, and while they waited, Ethan suddenly grew thoughtful again. Grandma, he said, can I ask you one more thing? Of course, she replied, smiling. You're full of questions this trip. He chuckled nervously. It's just, you and Grandpa had something special. You could see it in the way you looked at each other. Do you ever miss being loved like that? Margaret froze for a second. The question was tender, innocent, but it reached deep inside her. She took a breath before answering. Every day, she admitted softly. But missing love also means I was lucky enough to have it. Some people live their whole lives never knowing that kind of connection. Ethan nodded slowly. I hope I find something like that one day. You will, she said, her voice warm and steady. Just be kind, patient, and true to yourself. The right person will see you, really see you the way Grandpa saw me. They talked for hours, long after the coffee cups were empty. The waitress smiled at them every time she passed, probably thinking they were the sweetest pair she'd ever served. When they finally returned to the hotel, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft pink and orange hues. Back in their room, Margaret sat by the window again. Ethan joined her, leaning against the wall. You know, he said with a grin, this trip turned out way better than I expected. I'm glad, she said. I think we both needed it. He nodded. Yeah, I didn't realize how much I missed just talking like this. You always know what to say. Margaret smiled. It's because I've lived long enough to make a few mistakes and learn from them. Ethan chuckled. Guess I'll get there one day. You will, she said softly. Then, after a pause, she added, You've helped me more than you know, Ethan. I was stuck in my grief, in my memories. But you reminded me that life doesn't end just because someone you love is gone. It changes shape, but it keeps going. Ethan's eyes softened. I'm glad I could do that for you. You've always done that for me, helped me see things differently. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the small town flicker across the lake. Margaret felt peace settle over her. This trip had started as a simple getaway, but it had become something deeper, a bridge between generations. A healing moment that neither of them had expected. Before going to bed, Ethan turned to her one last time. "Grandma," he said softly, "thank you for coming with me. And thank you for listening." She smiled and reached out to squeeze his hand. "Always, my dear. That's what family is for." When the lights went out, Margaret lay awake for a while, thinking about the days they had shared. Her heart felt lighter, her mind clearer. She realized she had spent too much time looking back and not enough looking ahead. Ethan's presence had reminded her that love doesn't disappear. It simply takes new forms as she drifted off to sleep. She whispered quietly to herself, "I'm ready for tomorrow." But neither of them knew that tomorrow would bring one last, emotional moment, one that would leave Margaret truly speechless, and change the way she saw her life forever. The morning light crept softly into the hotel room, filling it with a calm glow. Margaret woke to the sound of birds outside and the faint hum of cars from the nearby street. For a moment, she didn't move. She just lay there, feeling peaceful in a way she hadn't in years. The trip with Ethan had changed something deep inside her. She felt alive again, not because her grief was gone, but because she finally understood it was okay to live alongside it. Ethan was still asleep. His arm flung across the pillow, his hair a mess. Margaret smiled, quietly getting up so she wouldn't wake him. She made herself a cup of tea from the small kettle on the table and sat by the window, watching the sunlight shimmer on the lake. It was their last morning at the hotel. Part of her felt sad that it was ending. Another part felt grateful. They had said everything that needed to be said. A little while later, Ethan stirred. "Morning, Grandma," he mumbled, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she teased gently. "You should get up. We have breakfast in an hour before checkout." He groaned, but eventually sat up, smiling at her. "You're too cheerful for this early," he said, rubbing his eyes. She laughed softly. "Maybe I just woke up on the right side of the bed." After packing their things, they went down to the breakfast area. The room was warm, filled with the scent of coffee and pancakes. They found a table by the window, and as they ate, they talked about little things movies they liked, memories from Ethan's childhood, and places they wanted to visit someday. It felt easy, like old friends catching up rather than grandmother and grandson when they finished eating. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Grandma," he began quietly, "can I tell you something important before we leave?" Margaret nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" He took a deep breath, then reached across the table and held her hand. His grip was firm, steady. "You know how I told you I wasn't sure about college?" He said, "Well, last night I thought about it a lot, and I think I know what I want to do. I want to study psychology." Margaret blinked, surprised but proud. "Psychology. That's wonderful, Ethan. What made you decide that?" He smiled faintly. "You did. Talking to you, hearing your stories, seeing how people carry emotions, grief. And love it made me realize I want to understand that. I want to help people the way you've helped me." For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, her eyes glistened. "Oh, Ethan," she said softly, squeezing his hand, "that's the most beautiful thing you could have told me." He shrugged modestly. "I mean it. You taught me that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about accepting. I want to study how people do that." Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were happy ones. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "I know. I hope he's watching us right now." They finished breakfast and walked to the car. The air outside was crisp, the sunlight bright but gentle. Margaret stood for a moment, taking one last look at the lake before getting in. "Goodbye, little getaway," she murmured. "You did more for me than I expected." The drive home was peaceful. Ethan played his favorite music again, humming quietly, while Margaret looked out the window, lost in thought. She thought about her husband, about the years that had passed so quickly, about how easily life could slip into routine if you didn't stop to breathe once in a while. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel stuck between past and present. She was simply here, alive, connected, content. When they reached her house, Ethan helped carry her bags inside. "Thanks for everything, Grandma," he said as he set them down. "This trip meant a lot to me." "It's meant a lot to me, too," she replied sincerely. "You reminded me of things I had forgotten, how to laugh, how to look forward." He smiled. "Guess we both helped each other." As he was about to leave, he turned back and said, "Grandma, can I tell you one last thing?" Margaret smiled knowingly. "You always can." He hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "You're the strongest person I know." "I don't think I ever told you that before." Her heart swelled. She stepped closer and placed her hand gently on his cheek. "That means more to me than you know," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Ethan, truly." He hugged her tightly, and she felt his warmth, the steady beat of his heart. For a moment, she wished her husband could see this. The bond between generations, the unspoken love that tied them together. When they finally let go, Margaret's eyes were damp, but she was smiling. "Go chase your dreams," she said. "And remember, wherever life takes you, I'll always be your biggest supporter." "I know," he replied softly. "And I'll come visit soon, promise." After he left, the house felt quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet she had known before. It wasn't lonely anymore. She made herself another cup of tea and walked out to the porch. The afternoon sun was golden, warming her face. She sat down, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. She thought about everything Ethan had said about college, about love, about healing. She realized that while she had come to the hotel searching for peace, it was her grandson who had unknowingly given it to her. Life had a strange way of circling back, giving you the lessons you didn't know you still needed. Margaret picked up her phone and opened her husband's old photo. "You'd be proud of him," she whispered with a smile. "And don't worry, I'm doing better now." For the first time in years, she didn't feel like something was missing. Instead, she felt whole, surrounded by love. Even in silence, that night before bed, Ethan sent her a text message. "Thanks again, Grandma. You're my favorite person in the world. I'll never forget what you told me." Margaret smiled, tears forming in her eyes as she typed back. "And I'll never forget what you said to me either. Ethan, I love you." As she put down her phone and turned off the light, she lay in bed feeling peaceful, her heart full. The trip had started as a simple weekend getaway, but it had become a turning point, a reminder that love, no matter its form, is what keeps life bright. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering softly to the quiet room, "He's going to be okay." Then she smiled, knowing she would be too.